From the crystalline archives of the Kalar Dominion, I record this not as history, but as confession. We first encountered humans at the outer fringe of mapped space. They arrived quietly, without ceremony or threat displays. Soft-skinned bipeds, inefficient in form, biologically fragile by every galactic standard. Their vessels were inelegant, functional slabs of metal scarred by prior use. Their weapons lacked refinement, their energy signatures crude and uneven. The Council of Many laughed. I remember the classification session clearly. Class E endurance, low threat potential. The conclusion was unanimous. A species that fragile could not survive long in a hostile universe, let alone challenge one that had mastered it. I agreed, I was certain. Yet even then, something felt wrong. During early diplomatic exchanges, humans spoke of their past with unsettling calm. They discussed extinction events as casually as seasonal storms. They referenced wars, internal wars, that erased millions of their own kind, entire cities turned to ash by their own hands. And they smiled. Not proudly, not cruelly, simply knowingly. We assumed this was unprocessed trauma, a species still fractured by its own violent adolescence. We mistook familiarity with loss for weakness. We failed to understand that they were not recounting conquest, but survival. Negotiations stalled, as they always do. Borders were drawn, influence contested. And so we applied pressure the same way we always had. Sanctions first, resource denial. Orbital presence meant to intimidate rather than engage. It was a formula refined over centuries. Lesser species folded within cycles. Humans did not. Their colonies endured shortages with an infuriating calm. Civil unrest predicted at near certainty never came. Instead, their internal transmission spoke of unity, of shared burden, of endurance without illusion. Their leaders did not promise relief, they promised resilience. Analysts flagged it as propaganda. I flagged it as anomaly. When intimidation fleets entered their space, humans did not scramble defenses, they did not issue threats, they watched and waited. Silence, we decided, meant submission. Restraint, we believed, meant fear. So, with bureaucratic indifference and confident detachment, the Council approved Phase 1 enforcement. A measured escalation, nothing irreversible, enough to remind them of their place. I signed the authorization myself. Only later did I understand what we had truly done. We had not cornered a weak species, we had pressed upon a pressure-forged one. We had mistaken patience for passivity. And in doing so, we disturbed something ancient, something buried deep within human history. Something that had learned long before reaching the stars that survival sometimes demands answering silence with fire. And as our fleets moved into position, I felt it for the first time. Not fear, anticipation. Because somewhere beyond our borders, the humans stopped enduring and began deciding. Phase 1 should have ended them. That was the certainty echoed through every chamber of the Dominion. Trade routes collapsed with mathematical precision. Human supply chains, thin, inefficient, overstretched, were severed node by node. Peripheral colonies reported food shortages within weeks. Energy rationing followed. By all predictive models, human morale should have imploded under the combined weight of hunger, fear, and isolation. Instead, something unprecedented occurred. Their fractures began to close. Where our analysts predicted riots, humans organized. Where we anticipated rebellion against their leaders, we observed cooperation across ideological, cultural, and planetary divides that had once been defined by violence. Old hostilities softened. Old symbols lost their power. Suffering, it seemed, was doing what peace never had. It was unifying them. From my observation post, I watched human engineers dismantle dying infrastructure and rebuild it with scavenged parts in defiant ingenuity. Cargo vessels meant for commerce were stripped, reinforced, and repurposed into supply lifelines. Civilian pilots flew routes our own simulations labeled statistically suicidal. Losses were accepted without spectacle. The missions continued regardless. Their leaders addressed their people frequently, but not as we expected. There were no promises of triumph, no declarations of inevitable victory. Instead, they spoke of responsibility, of shared burden, of endurance without illusion. "This will hurt," one leader said plainly, "but we will endure it together." That statement unsettled me more than any threat. Humans did not respond to suffering as other species did. Pain did not diminish them, it sharpened them. Our psychological warfare units reported diminishing returns within a single cycle. Fear-based messaging failed entirely. Threat projections, once sufficient to shatter civilizations, were mocked across human networks, repurposed into symbols of resistance and grim humor. They were laughing, not with joy, with defiance. The council dismissed my concerns. Pressure, they insisted, always worked eventually. It was not a matter of if, only when. They cited centuries of precedent. Species buckle under sustained deprivation. Biology demands it. Sociology confirms it. What we failed to grasp, what I failed to articulate in time, was that humans had evolved under constant pressure. Their homeworld was hostile. Their history was a chain of near extinctions. Their societies have been forged not in abundance, but in scarcity and conflict. We were not introducing hardship. We were reminding them of their natural state. Human broadcasts grew quieter, more focused. Gone were the emotional appeals. Gone were the pleas for understanding. In their place emerged logistics briefings, civilian training advisories, and messages emphasizing self-sufficiency. Their language shifted subtly, from survival to preparation. That shift did not register in our models. It registered in my instincts. Deep beneath their calm transmissions, beneath their disciplined endurance, something older than diplomacy was stirring. I recognized it not from data, but from myth, our own ancient stories of species pushed beyond tolerance, of civilizations that discovered clarity only at the edge of annihilation. Humans were no longer asking how to endure pressure, they were adapting to it. And adaptation, I realized too late, is never the end state. It is a transition. As Phase 1 dragged on, the Council authorized preparations for escalation, Phase 2 frameworks drafted, target lists refined, all with the same detached confidence. I watched the approvals pass through the system, each signature a quiet step forward. And somewhere, beyond our sensors and projections, beyond our assumptions and arrogance, humanity was learning exactly how much pressure it could survive, and how much it would return. The first retaliation was so small that we almost erased it from the records. A single patrol frigate failed to report near the Perseus trade vein. No debris field, no distress signal, no energy spike, just absence. Accidents, we reasoned, were an unavoidable reality of deep space operations. Even a perfect empire loses ships to probability. Then another vanished, and then a listening post, meant well within secured territory, went dark mid-transmission. The final data packet reached us fragmented and incomplete, corrupted by interference. Only one phrase translated cleanly from the human language stream that overrode our systems moments before silence. "You should have stopped." The words spread through the intelligence core faster than any alarm. Panic followed, sharp and immediate. Humans were not known for stealth at this scale. Their doctrine favored overwhelming force, visible presence, brute persistence. What we were observing did not fit the model. Yet the pattern emerged quickly. Supply convoys began disappearing along non-critical routes, never those carrying civilian aid, never vessels marked for evacuation. Command hubs lost power, communications severed with exquisite precision. Stations were disabled, not destroyed. Crews were left alive, confused, drifting, as if survival itself was part of the message. They were not striking blindly. They were speaking. I remember the first boarding footage recovered from a crippled command vessel. The visual feed shook as emergency lighting flickered, then stabilized. Humans moved through the corridor in disciplined silence. No shouted commands, no visible adrenaline surge. Their weapons were raised but not trembling. Their eyes, forward-facing, unblinking, tracked targets with unsettling calm. They did not celebrate when resistance ended. They did not linger. They moved on. There was no rage on their faces. That terrified me more than fury ever could. Savage species burn hot and fast. Their violence is loud, wasteful, emotional. Humans, in that moment, were something else entirely. Focused, restrained, purpose-driven. Violence supplied like a tool, not a release. The Council dismissed the incidents as desperate flailing, isolated actions meant to signal defiance before inevitable collapse. I watched senior strategists nod along, comforted by familiar narratives. Weak species lash out when cornered. It was a story as old as the stars. I did not nod.
Every instinct I possessed screamed that we were misreading the situation. These were not the strikes of a species losing control. They were the probes of one gaining it. Humans were not venting anger. They were measuring us, testing response times, escalation thresholds, command redundancies. Learning. I submitted a minority report urging restraint. I voted against escalation, quietly, anonymously, knowing full well the political cost if my identity were revealed. My objections were archived, acknowledged, and ignored. Phase 2 authorization passed within the cycle. As the Council prepared heavier sanctions and targeted strikes, human actions slowed, almost ceased. No further disappearances, no transmissions, no threats. The galaxy exhaled in relief. I did not. Silence returned, but it was not the silence of submission we had expected. It was deliberate, controlled, the kind of quiet that follows calibration. I reviewed the data again and again, tracing the pattern of vanished ships and disabled stations. Each strike had been positioned along our logistical spine. Not enough to cripple us, enough to map us, to understand how we moved, how we reacted, how quickly we panicked. Humans had learned more from those small engagements than our analysts had learned in decades of observation. That was when the realization struck me with terrifying clarity. A species that has survived its own near extinction does not fear escalation the way others do. It does not seek survival as its highest goal. Survival to them is history, it is memory. When such a species begins to test limits, it is not asking if it can endure what comes next. It is deciding how far it is willing to go. And as Phase 2 fleets began mobilizing, I understood the truth we had buried beneath arrogance and precedent. The first human retaliation had not been an attack, it had been a warning, and we had treated it as noise. The decision was framed as restraint, a limited strike, controlled, strategic. No planetary annihilation, no extinction-level weapons, just enough force to shatter resistance and force compliance. The Council approved it with practiced efficiency, citing precedent and probability. A demonstration, they insisted, nothing more. The target was a human colony world whose value lay not in minerals or position, but in history, a cultural nexus, a place humans spoke of with reverence rather than profit. Our analysts marked that sentiment as vulnerability. The bombardment lasted 7 minutes. I watched it unfold in real time. Orbital fire rained down with mathematical precision. Agricultural zones ignited first, wide swaths of cultivated land reduced to flame. City centers followed, cities fractured, structures collapsing in cascading failure patterns. Atmospheric interference bloomed across the hemisphere. Casualty estimates populated my display almost instantly. The numbers were high, but within what the Council labeled acceptable parameters. From a military standpoint, the operation was flawless. Minimal resource expenditure, maximum psychological impact. From a moral standpoint, I could not finish the thought. When the final salvo ended, we waited for the response we had come to expect. Emergency broadcasts, threats, desperate counterstrikes. None came. Human space went silent. No fleet rubbleizations detected, no diplomatic channels opened, no civilian transmissions leaked through. One cycle passed, then another. By the third, the Council was celebrating. Shock achieved, they declared. Psychological dominance restored. Analysts congratulated one another. The silence, they insisted, meant the lesson had been learned. I felt only dread. Silence in humans is never emptiness. It is containment. Their networks were dark, but not dead. Power fluctuations suggested activity beneath the surface, localized, controlled, deliberate. Civilian signals vanished entirely, replaced by encrypted traffic our best systems could not penetrate. It was not chaos, it was consolidation. Then the archives began to surface. Across our own information channels, fragments of ancient human media appeared. Stories, myths, dramatizations drawn from their earliest recorded histories. Tales of protectors pushed too far, of guardians who became monsters when their homes were destroyed, of vengeance framed not as cruelty, but duty. Our translators flagged the content as cultural artifacts, non-threatening, symbolic. I flagged them as warnings. Humans were not broadcasting demands. They were reminding themselves of who they had been before restraint, of what they had once done when survival alone was not enough, when memory, identity, and belonging were threatened. We had crossed an invisible line, not a military one, not a political one, a sacred one. That world we struck was more than a colony. It was an anchor, a place of shared memory, of continuity across generations scattered among the stars. By burning it, we had not weakened them, we had unified their grief. And grief, when shared by a species that has already endured its near end of itself, does not disperse, it concentrates. Only later would I understand the true magnitude of our error. We had given human suffering a direction. We had taken something they loved, and in doing so, we had provided their endurance with purpose. As the Council finalized Phase 2 escalation plans, I stared at the silent human sectors on the star map. No movement, no signals, no warnings. Just darkness. And I realized with a clarity that made my core tighten that we were no longer facing a species trying to survive pressure. We were facing one that had decided what it was willing to destroy in return. The silence did not mean submission. It meant the countdown had begun. Human fleets did not arrive through the usual corridors of space. They emerged from the void itself, unannounced, unsignaled, tearing through regions our sensors had long classified as navigationally unstable. At first, we believed our instruments were malfunctioning. The readings were chaotic, inconsistent. Then the shapes resolved, and denial became impossible. Their ships were nothing like the vessels we had cataloged before. Hull plates mismatched in composition and color, layered over older frames like scars that had never been healed. Weapon mounts protruded at unsafe angles, reactors pushed beyond tolerances our engineers would have deemed suicidal. These were not designs born of elegance or tradition. They were built to endure. They were built to finish something. For the first time since first contact, humans addressed the galaxy as a single voice. Every channel, civilian, military, diplomatic, was overridden simultaneously. The message carried no distortion, no emotional surge. It was calm, almost gentle. You taught us this language. Now listen carefully. Then the stars began to go dark. What followed was not chaos. It was orchestration. Human fleets moved with terrifying coordination, striking along vectors that revealed an intimate understanding of our defensive doctrine. Outer patrols were neutralized before they could relay warnings. Shipyards lost power mid-construction cycle, half-formed warships drifting uselessly in their docks. Energy grids failed in cascading patterns engineered to maximize paralysis, not destruction. Command AIs, once the backbone of our strategic superiority, were isolated, their decision loops flooded with contradictory inputs until they locked themselves into silence. Always military, always deliberate. They did not target civilian population centers. They did not glass worlds. They did not pursue annihilation. They dismantled our ability to respond, layer by layer, leaving our forces intact enough to understand what was happening and helpless enough to stop it. From my station, I watched entire battle fleets rendered powerless without a single vessel destroyed. Drives disabled, weapons locked, crews left alive to drift in open space, systems functional enough to sustain life, to think, to fear. That was when understanding finally took shape within me. Human rage
was not what our models predicted. It was not explosive, not uncontrolled, not blind. It was focused, channeled through discipline forged by centuries of internal conflict.
A fury refined by restraint, sharpened by memory, and released only when restraint had been exhausted. This was not vengeance for one world. This was a lesson. Across every disabled fleet and darkened station, the message was the same, written not in words, but in consequences. Never take from us what we cannot replace. The galaxy watched in stunned silence as a power that had never sought dominance demonstrated mastery without cruelty. Fear spread not because of what humans destroyed, but because of what they chose not to. And as reports flooded in from every front, I felt the weight of something far heavier than defeat settling over the Dominion. Because for all their precision, for all their restraint, this was still only the awakening. The humans had shown us what their rage looked like when it was controlled. And somewhere, beyond the edges of known space and reason, I sensed the truth tightening like a closing grip. They had not yet shown us what it looked like when restraint finally failed. Even then, the Council believed control was still possible. Our outer defenses lay crippled, our fleets adrift, our command architecture fractured, but the Council clung to precedent like a life support system. Humans, they insisted, had demonstrated restraint. Restraint could be exploited. Fear could still be induced. All wars, after all, were ended by demonstration. They chose demonstration over diplomacy. The decision was unanimous. A human core world was selected, densely populated, ancient by their standards, symbolically vital in ways our cultural analysts only partially understood. It was not merely a planet, it was a birthplace, a thread woven deeply into their collective identity. The Council labeled it a decisive target. Total annihilation was authorized. I watched the firing sequence begin from my station above the Kellar capital. Planet killer platforms aligned with flawless precision, energy reservoirs charged, drawing power from half a solar system. The calculations were perfect, the outcome inevitable. And then, it failed. They were waiting to see who we chose to be next. Because the most terrifying power in the universe is not the ability to destroy, it is the ability to stop and know exactly why you have earned that mercy. The surrender came quietly, unconditionally. It was not announced with fanfare. There were no parades, no celebrations, no grand declarations of victory. Instead, it arrived as a single communiqué, transmitted across every channel the Dominion still controlled. The words were precise, calm, and uncompromising. We will accept nothing less than truth, and we will accept no future devoid of memory. Humans demanded no territory, no tribute, no marks of conquest. They asked only for guarantees, for safeguards, for the preservation of what remained, and for the recording of history as it had unfolded. They required that the Dominion archive its crimes alongside our victories, our technological achievements, our own narratives of glory. They demanded that the next generation of our species learn, through unflinching truth, the consequences of misjudgment. It was not mercy, it was accountability. When human envoys finally arrived, they did so without armor. They bore no weapons, no symbols of intimidation. Instead, they carried the marks of mourning, black sashes, ceremonial adornments of their lost worlds, adornments that honored the billions extinguished and the cultures erased. Their faces were calm, but etched with a weight that no council chambers, no fleets, no scorched planets could have conveyed. They moved through the ruins of our command stations with deliberate care, noting what had been preserved, what had been lost, and what must be remembered. They listened to our explanations, our excuses, our justifications, and allowed none to stand unchallenged. I followed their movements from a distance, recording, observing, cataloging. And in their eyes I saw something I had never imagined. Not anger, not triumph, not pity, but clarity. A clarity that stripped away pride, that revealed the naked truth of our arrogance. That clarity broke me more effectively than any defeat in battle ever could. In the silence of that surrender hall, I felt the weight of centuries of misjudgment, of oversight, of presumption. Every calculated strategy, every attempted display of power, every assumption about human weakness, it all lay bare before me. And through it, I understood something fundamental about the species we had underestimated. Humans are not dangerous because they strike first. They are dangerous because they measure, they endure, and they respond with precision to the violations that matter most. And yet in their choice not to annihilate, not to impose dominion, not to rewrite the stars in their favor, they had demonstrated a power more profound than any fleet could wield. The power of moral certainty, of patient judgment, of consequence delivered with unerring accuracy. The surrender was complete, the lesson unyielding, and I, who had been witness, strategist, and chronicler, was left with the echo of their presence in every corner of my mind. I realized then that the humans had never sought conquest, they had sought understanding, and in their mercy they had forced the galaxy, and me, to confront truths far older than any of our empires. The Council had survived, the Dominion remained, but the scales had shifted irrevocably. And in that shift, I glimpsed the terrifying elegance of human restraint and the enduring power of memory. Humans are not gentle. Do not mistake their smiles, their laughter, their capacity for joy as weakness. Do not believe that their rituals of peace, their counsels, and their songs define the limits of their power. They are not peaceful. They are contained. Contained because they exist in constant negotiation with their own darkness. From birth, from the earliest moments of memory, they are taught to endure, to adapt, to endure again when adaptation is not enough. Every trial is a forge, every catastrophe a lesson. And when they are forced, when every boundary they consider sacred is violated, when survival itself is no longer enough, they respond with terrifying clarity. Not with fury uncontrolled, not with chaos unleashed, but with precision, with focus, with consequence calibrated to fit the crime. They measure, they choose, they act. The galaxy now knows this. We watched human fleets move with patient geometry, dismantling entire systems without cruelty, sparing life while demonstrating absolute capability. We watched entire species learn in silence that restraint can be a weapon just as sharp as any blade. We watched the Kalar Dominion burn in memory, left alive to understand the cost of misjudgment. Humans endure, they adapt, they strike only when necessary, but strike they will. Their rage is neither mindless nor blind, it is deliberate, it is focused, it is calibrated with a precision born of centuries spent surviving themselves. The galaxy now knows this Talinian. We watched human fleets move with patient geometry, dismantling entire systems without cruelty, sparing life while demonstrating absolute capability. We watched entire species learn in silence that restraint can be a weapon just as sharp as any blade. We watched the Kalar Dominion burn in memory, left alive to understand the cost of misjudgment. Humans endure, they adapt, they strike only when necessary, but strike they will. Their rage is neither mindless nor blind, it is deliberate, it is focused, it is calibrated with a precision born of centuries spent surviving themselves. The galaxy now knows this Talinian. We watched human fleets move with patient geometry, dismantling entire systems without cruelty, sparing life while demonstrating absolute capability. We watched entire species learn in silence that restraint can be a weapon just as sharp as any blade. We watched the Kalar Dominion burn in memory, left alive to understand the cost of misjudgment. Humans endure, they adapt, they strike only when necessary, but strike they will. Their rage is neither mindless nor blind, it is deliberate, it is focused, it is calibrated with a precision born of centuries spent surviving themselves. The galaxy now knows this Talinian. We watched human fleets move with patient geometry, dismantling entire systems without cruelty, sparing life while demonstrating absolute capability. We watched entire species learn in silence that restraint can be a weapon just as sharp as any blade.
We watched the Kalar Dominion burn in memory, left alive to understand the cost of misjudgment. Humans endure, they adapt, they strike only when necessary, but strike they will. Their rage is neither mindless nor blind, it is deliberate, it is focused, it is calibrated with a precision born of centuries spent surviving themselves. The galaxy now knows this Talinian. We watched human fleets move with patient geometry, dismantling entire systems without cruelty, sparing life while demonstrating absolute capability. We watched entire species learn in silence that restraint can be a weapon just as sharp as any blade. We watched the Kalar Dominion burn in memory, left alive to understand the cost of misjudgment. Humans endure, they adapt, they strike only when necessary, but strike they will. Their rage is neither mindless nor blind, it is deliberate, it is focused, it is calibrated with a precision born of centuries spent surviving themselves. The galaxy now knows this Talinian. We watched human fleets move with patient geometry, dismantling entire systems without cruelty, sparing life while demonstrating absolute capability. We watched entire species learn in silence that restraint can be a weapon just as sharp as any blade. We watched the Kalar Dominion burn in memory, left alive to understand the cost of misjudgment. Humans endure, they adapt, they strike only when necessary, but strike they will. Their rage is neither mindless nor blind, it is deliberate, it is focused, it is calibrated with a precision born of centuries spent surviving themselves. The galaxy now knows this Talinian. We watched human fleets move with patient geometry, dismantling entire systems without cruelty, sparing life while demonstrating absolute capability. We watched entire species learn in silence that restraint can be a weapon just as sharp as any blade. We watched the Kalar Dominion burn in memory, left alive to understand the cost of misjudgment. Humans endure, they adapt, they strike only when necessary, but strike they will. Their rage is neither mindless nor blind, it is deliberate, it is focused, it is calibrated with a precision born of centuries spent surviving themselves. The galaxy now knows this Talinian. We watched human fleets move with patient geometry, dismantling entire systems without cruelty, sparing life while demonstrating absolute capability. We watched entire species learn in silence that restraint can be a weapon just as sharp as any blade. We watched the Kalar Dominion burn in memory, left alive to understand the cost of misjudgment. Humans endure, they adapt, they strike only when necessary, but strike they will. Their rage is neither mindless nor blind, it is deliberate, it is focused, it is calibrated with a precision born of centuries spent surviving themselves. The galaxy now knows this Talinian. We watched human fleets move with patient geometry, dismantling entire systems without cruelty,